everybody. You are here to attend the digital event on annual planning without the panic, how to plan like a pro and keep your sanity. I am Matthew Volm, CEO and founder of RevOps Co-op. We have a global community of 17,000 plus revenue operators from all over the globe. And we have a whole slew of programs that we offer to our members, like these digital events, like the in-person events that I mentioned. We have a Slack group. We have courses, education, a whole lot of different things that you can get involved in. This event will be recorded, and like all of our digital events, it will go up on our website along with a full write-up afterwards. But I want to get into the topic of the day today and first quickly introduce our panelists who are going to be dropping some knowledge on us about how we can plan better. So I'm going to do some quick introductions here and then just kind of ask a quick question from our panelists. So we have Matthew, who is the VP of RevOps over at Seismic. We have Nandini, who is the SVP of RevOps at Zywave. We have Avtar, who is the VP of RevOps at Benchling, and Eddie, who is a Director of Sales Strategy and Planning at Intercom. And then we also have Werner, who is the CEO and co-founder over at Lative, and Lative is also an incredible community partner of RevOps Co-op. So we've got a large group and I want to get into the content. So I just want to go around the horn really quickly and I want to ask you all just one question, say hello, add anything to the professional introduction that I just mentioned. But then my non-RevOps, non-work related question that I also want to hear from the panelists here is, if I were to go to your Spotify, Apple Music, wherever it is that you listen to music, what would you consider the most embarrassing song on your recently played list that you would be embarrassed if I announced? So that's my question, my non-work related question for you. So Werner, I'm actually going to start with you on this. We're going to go Werner, Nandini, Matthew, Eddie, Avtar. So we'll give our guests a little bit of time to answer that. But Werner, tell us a little bit more about you, yourself, and then what's your most embarrassing recently played song?
Okay, so a bit about myself. So RevOps, 20 plus years since the early 2000s. So hence why I don't think I have much here. There wasn't as much technology around back then. And then founded Lative about 3-4 years ago, and just to make sales planning just a bit easier for all of us and a bit more structured. So, and that's pretty much me. But probably, I think so will be one of my daughter's songs, the Dear Lupa song. I think wouldn't ever be on my playlist, but it's a good song. It's quite catchy. And I thought actually it's not that bad, so maybe I will add it. But so yeah.
All right, we got Dua Lipa to kick us off. Nandini, you're next. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, and then what's the most embarrassing recently played song?
Right. Hi, everyone. And thank you, Matt, for inviting me to this forum. I must say, what you guys are doing with creating this community and bringing RevOps together is incredible. I have been in RevOps for now almost 18 to 20 years. Started with sales ops, where it wasn't even a thing, and now leading the charter at RevOps. I call myself the CFO's RevOps, which might be a controversial thing, but CRO, CFO, I definitely am a CFO's RevOps person. You will see that in our conversation where I've led both FP&A and RevOps together, connected at heart. And I must say, for the question that you asked, I think my entire playlist is going through midlife crisis. So that's, having said that, I'm a sort of Swiftie, but more of a caught in the ABBA world kind of a music listener. But I think my go-to blasting music when I'm alone in the car and I really need thinking time is Taylor Swift's Red.
All right, Matthew, we got Dua Lipa, we got Taylor Swift, even an ABBA shout out. So tell us one or two sentences about yourself, my friend, and then what would be your song of choice to put on the
Yeah,
embarrassed?
good afternoon, everyone, and good evening for some folks in Europe. I'm very glad to be here. Father of two, below 3 years old, so I'm on my way to quickly get Werner's haircut and hairstyle, not turning gray first and then disappearing. Based out of Austin. And then what's I say embarrassing in my playlist is that I recently discovered Benson Boone, which I like, and I realized when I clicked on the song that I was number 2 billion.100 million so far. So I think that the embarrassing fact was that it took me 2 billion people in the world to get to it. So that's it about me.
All right, Eddie, you're up, my friend.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Eddie. Excited to be here. I'm at RevOps for more than 12 years. It started as finance, then sales ops, and in recent years, it's RevOps. and excited to talk here everything about annual planning. And the embarrassing one, I would say, it's the recent sensation. I have 3 kids, and they saw the movie on Netflix, K-pop Demon Hunters. So that's really on heavy rotation currently on Spotify, and I must say it's very catchy.
I love it. All right, Av, you're going to round us out here.
Hey everyone, Offshore Varma calling in from California. Run RevOps now at 4 different companies, everything from 0 in revenue to 350 million. Excited to be here. Thanks for having me, Werner and team. My embarrassing one, I've got 2 young kids as well. They haven't gotten to K-pop Demon Hunter yet, but they are on Baby Beluga, and it's literally the only song that I can think of because it's played on repeat constantly in my household. So probably not by choice, but that's what's going through my head right now.
I love it. All right. Well, a very wide variety, which is incredible, but I'd also expect nothing less from a panel of seasoned revenue operators. Werner, I want to turn it back to you to talk about some of the most common pitfalls that you've seen at Lative across organizations. Annual planning is such a huge, high stakes thing, and how you approach it really depends on your company's model, growth stage, the tools that you have available or maybe lack thereof. And we obviously have an incredible panel who's going to represent different perspectives of this, whether it's go-to-market, shifts in your go-to-market motion, AI adoption, hypergrowth, a couple of different things. But from your perspective, at Lative, you obviously work with a lot of different types of companies as well. So let's start by talking about what are some of the most common pitfalls that you've seen across the organizations that you're typically working with when it comes to annual planning.
I think, yeah, no, thanks, Matt. It's been interesting because there's quite a lot of consistency, and I thought, okay, how do we really summarize this? And I think most of the time we see, well, almost 9 times out of 10, even higher than 9.5, it's a lot of spreadsheets. So, and it is because it's just there's just so many pieces, right, to do an annual plan. It's difficult, and it is quite siloed. We see that. But also what we see is because we got the spreadsheets, and sometimes, like I was on with a prospect last week, was interested, and they're going, look, we're probably a 7 out of 10. We're comfortable with the process from the manual side. But where they're struggling is on this feedback loop, right? Now, we're still seeing a lot of assumptions. There's still a lot of assumptions being used, so struggling with the bottom-up operating data. So lots of assumptions on, okay, we'll just say our capacity is at 90% of the quota plan. And, as we know, a bit dangerous, but there's just there's a lot of assumptions still being used. And then what we've also seen a lot on the execution, and we've all experienced this, we seasoned at annual planning, is once the plan's all been done, a lot of the time we ask the question, just go, okay, so are you looking at where you said you'd be in March to what you finished, when you first signed off on that plan, or we're in September now. And a lot of the time, no one's going back and looking at it. So there's very little ability to then do any proactive intelligence that we're seeing. And I think this is all driven from the manual spreadsheets that we see today.
Yeah. It makes a lot of sense. And I know I've been there before. I've created plenty of annual plans in spreadsheets. It's been super painful. I've gotten through all of that. And then the last thing I want to do is actually reforecast or try to even compare actual results against that plan because it's a lot of work and a lot of effort. And so I want to talk a little bit about maybe some ways that we can solve for some of those things. And I have a couple of different topics that each of the panelists are going to hit on here. So Matthew, I actually want to start with you, and I want to talk a little bit about different AI tools that can ultimately help increase sales productivity within the sales org. So I'm looking, we're 13 minutes past the hour. It took us that long to first mention AI, but obviously you can't get through one of these things without talking about that. So you've been implementing AI within the sales org at Seismic. So can you talk a little bit about how you're factoring the impact of AI into annual planning, how you're leveraging it, and maybe more importantly too, where you're not using it? Because I think that's super important to see how you're applying it and where you're choosing not to as well.
Yeah, good. Great question. I think planning definitely always has an element of productivity gains that we bake into capacity models. We always expect more from the same or from less, and more bookings per A, more AR plus CSM, more pipeline per SDR. And with the rise of AI, it's on everybody's mouth and everybody's roadmap. It's important for all of you to factor how AI is going to help productivity and what are the tools that you're going to implement next year to drive that. So the initial wave of AI solution that we've launched at Seismic were geared toward particularly the sales productivity aspect. So we launched Nooks about 2 years ago, and we essentially got 30% productivity gains in terms of pipeline production from our SDRs and from our commercial. So Nooks being a parallel dialer that allows you to dial multiple calls at once and land to the right first person who picks it up. We also launched, and that's much more recent, just 2 months ago, we launched our AI SDR on the website. So now it is driving real-time conversation with prospects, and it's actually improving the experience that prospects have on the website by being able to get answers to their questions immediately versus waiting for the next call. And so it's already been creating a lot of pipeline for us. And we have solutions like Zoom Info Copilot and others that help with the account research, with the emails, and what AEs or SDRs need to get more personalized outreach to their customers. So definitely, we are baking these in, plus additional tool that we are investigating right now to help with the productivity and help figure out what are the capacity gains that we're going to get into next year. You asked a question where we are not using it yet. I love to use it in some areas of churn prediction a little bit more than we are doing today, but it does require advanced data scientists and data modeling that sometimes you don't have. So I would say the danger when you think about some of the advanced AI solutions is, do you actually have the internal capabilities to leverage the tool to actually build a sophisticated machine learning model on churn or other types of solutions? Because if you don't, just don't waste time. We need to understand what's your internal level of readiness that you want to have before launching or embarking into a new solution. So that's what we're thinking right now.
Before I kind of move off of the topic of AI, any other panelists have any other, whether it's specific products, use cases for AI, things that you're leveraging it for as it relates to planning or outside of planning that they want to share?
Yeah, there's a couple of tools. I've heard a lot of good things about Nook, so it's interesting to see that you're actually using it, Matthew, and seeing that 30% uptick in pipeline generation. The only other tools that not using necessarily for annual planning, but for pipeline generation and account planning are Endgame and Pocus. Pocus, I would say, is more focused on the SMB and market side of things, where you take 6 cents and you put it on crack, basically, to be able to see all the intent data out there, the potential people that you should be reaching out to. If there's product data that's indicating, hey, someone is hitting the max, you should go reach out to them. And then Endgame is more on the enterprise side, being able to actually understand the internal data for your Salesforce, Slack channels, Google Drive, etc., and incorporate that into ChatGPT, looking externally at hey, if I'm going to go prospect into account XYZ, how does that mix with my personas and the way that we build account plans, the way that we build our, we have 3 whys, why anything, why benchling, why now? And it will actually structure out a draft version of that based on external and internal data. And so that's been super useful just in terms of getting reps up to speed as we're scaling up the business and hiring a bunch of people. They don't have all the internal historical knowledge. The ability to tap into our data and surface it in a coherent, standard way is super useful.
Yeah. All right, so I have 2 questions that I want to ask. So, Werner, I'm going to ask you this first one from the audience. They're asking about how to approach annual planning or just planning and the quality of their data. So obviously at Lative, you have a product. That product is very helpful, useful to folks as it relates to completing, measuring annual plans. Obviously, though, it requires data to be able to put your plans together. And so they're asking about how can you identify and ensure that you're actually working with good, reliable data. One of those things where you don't know what you don't know. What are some ways or feedback or advice that you give to people that might either object or say, oh, our data is not great, or our data is not good, or it's not good enough? How can people, operators out there, evaluate whether their data is good enough to move forward with their planning, or if they actually have some really big gaps that they need to solve before they can put together a reliable annual plan?
Yeah, no, that's true. And I think again, everyone has their data challenges and that you got to work with. No data sets are always perfect. They get better, but there's always gaps and holes in some of the data. But I think it's always to start with the bare minimum of what you need. I've always been a big proponent of bottom-up data, understanding just what is the productivity of the team, what are they producing at, and that you can get to a very simple calculation to be able to do that. When you want to start doing it more by dimensions, yes, then you need the data sets to be a bit more complete. I think it's starting with the bare minimum of what you need. And that starts to go, okay, so what's the plan we want to build and what is the bare minimum we need to make sure we've got that information? And if we don't have it, what are we going to do to get it? That's going to make the annual plan better. I've always thought of an annual plan quite simply, right? You've got a number of salespeople you're going to have, and you've got a target to hit. One by the other gives you your quotas, gives you your plan. How you then divide that up throughout the organization is where it gets messy. So you can start very simply, and then to wherever your data set will take you is how complex will you get or how granular will you get, I should say, to solve for it. My advice is start with what you've got and keep it simple. You can always then build out as you need it as the data gets better.
Yeah. And we have a question from Adam that I want to ask you because you said specifically you are CFO's RevOps, right? Adam's question is about how are high functioning organizations breaking down some of the data silos that currently exist within planning? He gave the example of finance owns the number and capacity, RevOps owns the data, scoring and territories, and then you have sales leaders that kind of fight you every step of the way. And so what does good look like when it comes to collaboration and alignment as the CFO's RevOps kind of sees it?
Um, Great question, by the way. And I think that it is more of a collaborative nature that you're going to see that I led the FP&A team at one point. But regardless of whether I lead it or not, FP&A and RevOps have to be tied to the hip alongside the go-to-market team. And that collaborative ownership of what is the top up, what is our intention that we want to drive, how how are we going to chunk it into pieces to build off of what Werner was saying, get the big picture right, which is what FP&A would do or the CFO does along with the CRO and the CEO, understand and internalizing that picture and then breaking it into a story that seems step by step build up of how do we get to that number is critical, and what RevOps does. So I have always been a person who starts with tell me what the big picture is, and then I will build the building blocks. Reverse is better. And that's how I see it working. But it is a collaborative, it cannot happen in silos. It is a disaster if it's in silos.
Yeah. And Eddie, I have a question for you. Shifts in overall pricing and revenue models that we're seeing out there. So let's say, 5 years ago, everything was subscription, kind of user seat based. Now, then we've kind of made there's a big push towards like usage and consumption based. Now we're also talking about outcome based and all of these other ways that you can price and monetize and drive revenue. And at Intercom, you all are kind of going through this shift of, from subscription to ultimately consumption. And so my question for you are, how should people consider changes in revenue models, monetization, as it relates to their planning process? Because there's a couple of obviously different things that could be impacted there. You might have things where you were previously charging per seat. Now you're going to charge for things that you use. And maybe the things that you use that you're going to charge for, you might actually have some data on that, right? Of like, oh, here's how many, making this up, tickets you've created, right, in the past. Or you could start charging for things that people are going to use, which you've never maybe tracked in the past, and now there's an absence of data. But then there's also conversion rates and all these other things that are kind of at play. There's just a lot to kind of unpack and think about there. As you've been at Intercom, how has the evolution of pricing, monetization, and kind of your revenue model, how has that changed the way that you approach or kept things the same as it relates to annual planning?
Great question. And one that I'm very passionate about is definitely something that we experienced in recent quarters here at Intercom. So Intercom did move more and more into the AI product. We have a customer support AI agent, and it's based on usage and outcome-based pricing. The more resolution it solves, you pay per resolution. And the idea was just to tie the success of the customer to the success of the company. That made us shift, especially in our existing business, to move from a more subscription, booking-based, classic SaaS world to consumption, outcome-based world. And yeah, so on the planning side, it makes it a bit longer, definitely more complex, and it requires a more sophisticated models, right? It's no longer I close 10 deals, each deal has a average deal size, and I just multiply it by number of A's and stuff like that. I'm simplifying. I know it's not that simple, but that's like high level in a booking world. And in a consumption-based model, it's completely different. We leverage teams that we'd never leveraged before, or leverage in very minor ways. So we started working very closely with our data science team to create sophisticated and granular models so we can have good estimations on the consumption of our existing customers and building sophisticated models of what we can expect with those new products that are based on outcome-based pricing. And we leverage our data engineering team as well to build us the reporting and the data, as Werner mentioned. Data is very important. So we had to leverage some more technical teams to just flash that data for us in order to help, but also for the sales team to see all that real time and see how the various metrics impacting their progress against the new goals. And as Nandini said, collaboration with finance was critical because they had to change their models as well to more consumption, include things like pay-as-you-go, uncontracted usage. So the FP&A teams are very, very close partner of ours, and in every planning cycles we work very closely. And I think the piece that's very important and usually is not focuses like all the other piece of like creating the model, assign quotas, assign targets, is the change management element. So once you move from a model that was very dominant, the SaaS subscription model, great model, and moving to consumption, there's a learning curve. There's a change management element of it. Those are sellers that were used to bookings. So a lot of investment in enablement, communication, office hours, tours with different teams to go deep and explain the change, and a lot of reinforcement and communication to land the plane on the new models and the new targets and the new quotas.
Yeah. What was the biggest surprise? What was the thing that surprised you the most, maybe that you weren't expecting when moving from the subscription-based sort of model over to a consumption-based model? I know one of the things that I'll say, like, for me, that seems obvious now, but at least at first on the surface didn't really resonate, is like, when you start thinking about things on a consumption or outcome-based model, it was like I kind of totally I didn't forget, but I never thought about compensation for like the sales team and people there. It's like, oh yeah, if you're not paying annually up front and now you're using it, it's like, all right, yeah, like how do you pay them? What's their job versus the job of like, support success, if there is any? Like those are just all things where I'm like, that's a whole slew of problems and things to think through that I never thought about that weren't obvious on the surface. So was there anything like that you encountered as it relates to planning and you were going through this process and the shift?
So the change management element of it, specifically also around the compensation. And in my role, I also lead the incentive design at Intercom for the go-to-market team. So yeah, as you said, people were used to, I close the deal, I get immediately the credit for that, the quota retirement, and now it spreads across peaks, and sometimes there's no contract, and it's just like pay as you go, and there's seasonality.
Yeah.
So that was the piece of it, like emphasizing, thinking about showing like the very scenario, how you, in some cases, earn better, but like with slightly different periods or like fluctuations and variance between months. So definitely the change management, also translating things like accelerators in a booking world to accelerators in consumption-based worlds. The base is way bigger, so the rates seem smaller, but the dollars amount might be even higher. So yeah, I would say that's definitely the biggest issue.
Yeah. Did you see a lot of pushback from that?
There was initial pushback, and I think it's very normal. I think it's part of it that you should plan for some pushback. Every change, and especially a big change and radical change like this, and people are not used to it. There's concerns. And the best way, I think, to address it is continue to reinforce, move the mentality, like when you're focusing on usage, to move the mentality from booking to usage, to think long term, and also show with data that the way you build it, that the company success is building on top of it, and also the seller success is also can be positively impacted by that. So it's a lot of examples, simplifying, a lot of enablement. But yeah, definitely there's a pushback, and you just need to reemphasize and also understand it will take time. I think initially we had more pushback, but as the quarter and a half progressed, people saw that it's beneficial for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, quick question, actually. So, Eddie, when you were doing this, did you guys think about kind of an intermediary step where instead of going fully to consumption, you do something kind of in the middle where you say, hey, you're going to buy credits that renew every month and don't roll over? Because from an FP&A perspective, you can treat that almost like SaaS subscription. And so if you sell a 1-year contract that has monthly credits that don't roll over, but just start afresh, it effectively works the same way from an accounting perspective as SaaS. That's one of the things that we're thinking about right now. So just curious if you've thought about that at all.
We thought about it. At that point, we didn't have a lot of those type of products, buckets that don't roll over and things like that. So we pushed for that the change management will make it easier to move almost completely to the usage-based model. And then for things like these type of things, there are spiff on top of it or multipliers, and to address those.
Got it. Makes sense.
Yeah. Nandini, I'm curious, again, you've led FP&A, you've led RevOps, you have a good kind of feedback on both. I guess anything to add on maybe in response to the question that Avtar had? And then I got one other question for you after you get to that one.
I was going to say, Matt, we actually need a consumption as a topic and how you're handling recurring revenue, this movement from committed contracts to consumption as a whole different topic and discussion on a panel. And I'd love to be part of that. We are going through an in-between phase, by the way, Avatar and Eddie, where we have committed contracts that continue, but we do charge for overage. So it's not capped, and there is no sales event when seats increase or usage increases, but every contract now has an uplifted value to bill overage. And that by itself is a massive undertaking as a company. So I can only appreciate what you went through, Eddie, there. But it is actually aligning to the outcomes with the customer. So I think it's important. There are now 2 companies, Enterprise DB as well as Zywave, that I'm seeing this idea being toyed. So it is here to stay, and RevOps getting in front of it, FP&A getting in front of it on how we actually start projecting this consumption with the telemetry information of usage that might be informing this revenue is important.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And this is a great example of, I always try to harp on or talk about how like finance and understanding accounting and the financial impact of things is so critical for any successful revenue operator, because my kind of light bulb moment went off a little bit, Avtar, as you were asking that question, is like, yeah, there's ways that you can position these things as consumption based, call it pricing, but on the accounting side, there's the same sort of financial implications as you previously had under a SaaS or subscription based business, even though it's very different how you're actually charging. But the mechanics of all that are what can then actually lead you to allow to still pay people pretty similarly. You can still incentivize them to do things to drive the minimum up, or to drive expansion. You can disincentivize them from allowing for credit rollovers, right? Like there's all these other things if you understand how the mechanics of both of those work.
Absolutely. And it allows you to take that kind of middle step to get both your sellers and your customers used to this new model without changing too much of the way that they're being billed or being compensated.
Yeah. Actually, Avtar, question for you around like just going through the planning process as it relates to growing and really hyper growth sort of companies. So I've been through this before, and obviously we all know like what's that standard caveat they give you whenever you're buying stocks, like historical performance is not an indicator of future performance, right? Certainly also not true as your company goes from 0 to 1, 1 to 10, 10 to 50, 50 to 100 and 100 and beyond, right? So how should people be thinking about planning as you're going through some of those big growth cycles, especially as it relates to some of the bigger investments that people ultimately have to make, like hiring salespeople and investing in headcount?
Yeah, I guess the wrong place to start with any of this is with headcount, right? I'd say the right place is with working, as Nandini was saying, in lockstep with your FP&A team. Like, what is the growth target? What is the actual like revenue projections that we have for next year? Trying to figure out how realistic that is or not. And from there, you can kind of back into the amount of sales capacity that you need. And that's where it becomes a little bit more of a math exercise, right? So, like, what's average rep productivity based on historical or trailing quarter averages? How long do reps take to ramp? And actually having a clear definition of what ramp is. The one that I like the best is selling 2 deals over some dollar threshold, depending on what your ASP is. For us, we say 2 deals over 75K, you're officially ramped. And then looking at how many reps are productive today and what your attrition typically looks like. As we go into hypergrowth, you're going to see some amount of attrition. So using those variables, you can figure out how many incremental reps you would need to get to whatever your revenue targets are for next year. But that math exercise is kind of just a starting point, right? So you can go out and hire 50, 100, 200 reps if you want to, at least. But if you don't have the pipeline, SDR coverage, marketing demand, SEs, frontline sales managers, all you're going to do is bring a bunch of people on and set them up to fail, right? Your average productivity is going to go down, and you're going to start to see CAC payback ratios go out of whack. You're going to start seeing more attrition. It's going to be complete failure. So as part of the planning process, you have to stress test whether the system can actually feed and manage that many reps. And to me, that's where RevOps is to kind of connect the dots between all the cross-functional players, so marketing, sales, customer success, FP&A, just to make sure that whatever revenue projection or desire the business is expecting for the next year doesn't come at too much of a cost. And so then you kind of start playing with scenarios, right? Okay, if we hire this many people in Q1, what does our sales capacity look like? If we take some kind of average of 80% attainment, what does that actually look like for next year? What's that going to cost the business to hire the SEs, the SDRs, the managers, et cetera? And does the finance team sign up for that alongside with their revenue projections for the following year? So kind of tying it all together, it's like revenue target first, the productivity math. Can the system actually absorb all of that? And then building out different scenarios to figure out, okay, what levers do you want to tweak and play with to actually figure out whether the cost is going to be something that the business is okay with to get the desired outcome.
Yeah. And you said for you all, a ramped rep is someone who's sold 2 deals over a certain deal size. Is that right? And what sort of timeline do you typically see for people who are able to get to that spot?
It's a measurement segment, right? So typically in like an enterprise model, you're looking at 9 months. The best in class I've ever seen is 6.5 months on the enterprise side, selling into the Fortune 500. In the SMB space, our ramp time is 45 days. They're not selling 75K deals, but there's a lot more kind of hand raisers in that space. And so it really depends on what your sales process, sales methodology looks like, how much of it is, marketing PLG led versus sales assisted versus sales led. But anywhere from that 45 days to 9 months should be your goal. Anything beyond 9 months, I think, is a really challenging place to be.
Yeah. And don't underestimate the amount of time that it takes. Also, don't take for granted that people will just get ramped based on how you want them to get ramped, right? You're like, oh, well, I hired them and I gave them systems access. Like, what do you mean they're not out closing the deals that we expect? It's like, well, what does your enablement program look like? And then do our current reps maybe overflowing with pipeline? Are they going to continue to have enough pipeline coverage if we start adding other reps in the same sort of territories? Do we have enough kind of TAM to go around? There's just a lot of considerations there that, again, a lot of times people will just default to like, oh, my ramp time is 90 days to get someone kind of fully ramped. And it's like, well, why? But don't forget about all those other things that we just talked about as it relates to planning as well, because those are all going to influence how realistic it is for you to actually hit those revenue targets that you're ultimately setting out to hit. And so with that, Werner, I want to transition into kind of the group part of this discussion and kind of open some of these questions up to all of the panelists. So the first thing I want to talk about is the biggest challenge that you all have, or really the hardest part of getting your go-to-market planning process right? Is it the assumptions? Is it the headcount? Is it the change management or the executive alignment? Is it the new initiatives? Is it being agile? Like, what's the hardest part? And Avatar, I know you've got to jump in a few minutes. So I'm going to start with you, and then we'll go kind of Avatar, Nandini, Eddie, Matthew.
Sure. I think the biggest thing for me is starting early, right? Making sure that I typically like to start for a February 1st start date. I want to start by September 1st. So we're starting our annual planning right now. We have a RevOps offsite in a couple of weeks from now to go through all of the action items, working closely with FP&A, making sure that by after Thanksgiving, I have a plan that I can get out in front of our CRO and our CFO to get their blessing to actually then start divvying up segmentation, territories, to be able to hand everyone at the beginning of January their accounts and their territory for the following year. And the goal there is I give everyone a 13-month year, right? Everyone that's in seat by January 1st, they have all of January to plan how they're going to go hit their number, what accounts are going to focus on, what the account plans are. So February 1st, they're running and they're just closing. And the second thing is really just building around flexibility, right? So building out those different, in the base case, the different models of like, okay, if we invest super heavy and we go bonanzas and hire a ton more reps than we think, what does that look like versus, a more conservative approach? And so playing with those different optionalities and walking through the pros and cons with your leadership team is super critical. I guess here working from first principles as well.
Yeah.
But I think that speaks for itself.
All right, Nandini, what about you?
So I think the hardest part is actually aligning, especially in a growth environment. The quintessential characteristic of a growing company is change is bound to happen, and every year there is a change. And that anticipating that change, being prepared for it, and having systems that you've built that are agile enough that can tolerate the change and pivot as quickly as possible is important. I think the hardest part is if we do not have captured data, say at product level or at recurring revenue, seeing the last 2 years of at least performance that can inform the change is probably the hardest part of planning.
Eddie, how does your answer differ on?
Yeah, it's not that different, but I think it's all tied to, I think everybody experiences like our environment is so much more dynamic than it used to be, and the pace of change is so frequent. So I think the biggest piece is feeling comfortable with change and ambiguity, feeling a bit more comfortable with almost constant change and changes even within the planning cycle, that like you're approaching the end of the planning cycle, but then something new comes up and you need to make sure it incorporated in the plan. So I think the piece is just being, first of all, like mentally being comfortable with that if possible. And as I mentioned, making it flexible and agile and create some mechanism to support frequent changes or less moment strategic decisions, because it's all come from good business strategy, good business objective, and just feeling comfortable with it and being able to respond. And I think another piece of that is having to rely more on assumption. I know Werner mentioned the quality of data and that you shouldn't have a lot of assumptions in your planning cycle, but we're in relatively uncharted territory, right? With like new AI products and new go-to-market motions, a lot of new things. Some of the things needs to be based on assumption and not like critical, strong, verified data that you have for like, I don't know, 5 years in. But some of it you need to give it to assumptions that make sense and that you agree with your stakeholders, like the sales leadership and the finance partners.
Yeah. Hardest part of planning from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think it ties to what people have said, but I'll cover a couple of more items. So I think the hardest part is that you will be facing disruption and something that you didn't see coming, like a curveball, as I would call them. You will see an M&A, a riff, a new leader joining and wanting something completely different. You will see a promotion cycle that doesn't pan out just until the very last minute. So there's going to be something that doesn't go.
pandemic could,
A global pandemic.
you know?
It's going to happen. So I expect it to happen. And I would say my actionable tip is that, of course, you need to be prepared for it, like we've said, but I think you also need to help your team elevate the dialogue from the blocking and tackling of, comp plan, the right territories, and also add to that the element of the cohesive strategy. So how, next year, if you haven't yet, how are you going to achieve these numbers? It's not just about plugging the right people and moving them to the right territories and making sure they're all aligned and the comp metrics. You also need to understand how the sales is going to work with the partner team and the CS team and the services team, and what I always recommend to other organizations and ourselves, of course, first is having this one page summary of your objective and key results, and this should not be function by function. This should be cross-functional objective, like we're going to increase NRR by X, and this is how we're going to achieve it, and this is how we're going to measure the different subcomponent of these OKR. So I would say no one is going to ask for that necessarily, so you need to be the one pushing for it.
Yeah. And Matthew, real quick, you mentioned, I know in the chat that like asking about your enablement strategy is another key piece. Obviously, you work at a enablement company, so I know that's going to be super important to everything that you all do. But how should folks be thinking about enablement as a piece of the annual planning process, and maybe some of the specific metrics, KPIs within your plan that solid enablement is really needed in order to drive?
Yeah, I would say one way of thinking about it, and I'm going to simplify it for the sake of time, is when you think about change management, what are the new behaviors that you will expect in the new year? And how are you going to make sure that these behaviors are not only incentivized, but that you have the right level of transition, socialization, top down, bottom up, with champions all around the board to help you get this change. One of the mistake that we did in the previous year was to expect that day one you communicate all the new comp plans, and on your good luck with that. You need to truly have this understanding of what are the big rocks that are going to change next year. And between now, because early September to either end of December, end of January, depending on the cycle, how are you going to weave that change within the organization, whether it's creating a new org structure, you're creating a new aspect of it. Some will be confidential, but some will require more socialization. So building this enablement, bring your enablement leader along the cycle and not just expecting them to tag along at the very end is critical. So bringing enablement early, thinking about the big hooks, thinking about these behavior changes are some of the recommendations that I would have.
Yeah. And Werner, I have a question for you before we show that slide again and do a wrap up here. So you obviously building a company that's delivering a software product to help people with their planning process. You have been a revenue operations leader at a variety of companies in the past as well. So you have been building annual plans for years and years and years. Now you're helping a lot of other companies to do this in the right way as well. How has the planning process changed, like versus what it used to look like versus what it is now? Some of the things that you're doing as you build your own plans, some of the things that your customers are doing as they build their own plans. Like, what are the things that have changed? What's stayed the same over the last how many years of planning?
Thanks, Matt. I think it's interesting. I mean, looking back, what stayed this, I might start at the end. What stayed the same? Financially, at the end of the day, any sales organization that has salespeople has to do a plan. So to do that, you need to have salespeople. If you've got salespeople, you need to have a compensation plan, and you've got to be able to pay them and generally give them a quota. Or some companies don't even have quotas. For me, that's always stayed the same. I think in general, in my experience, that there's going to be a CRM in place that stays the same. That's generally going to give you data that you use to operate. I think what has shifted in the last years is the complexity of planning. As Eddie mentioned, right? Go into a consumption model, take your annual plan of what it was and times that by about 10 to get to a consumption model that actually makes sense, that you can actually comp people, understand it. And also it's two worlds, right? We see worlds where you're looking at, I want to land a deal, so I want to capture that, but like a consumption, and then I want to track the billings that happened after that, and then I want to tie how long did it take for the billings to happen after I closed that deal. And so you've got these two worlds that are starting to collide that are quite complex, and you've got to think about the plan in two different ways. I think territory planning has become far more complex than it used to. Generally, it used to be quite easier. You take a map and you divide people up based on that map and give them their postcodes. Territories are way more organized now, where it's more about the accounts. The accounts have a quota. If you've got this account, you're going to expect this quota. You're going to add those all up, and you're going to land up with a quota for that territory. So the complexity of that, I think, has grown, and it's you got to sort of pick them. There's 10,000 ways to do that. And I think, getting into things like the structure of the quotas. What should the quotas be? What shouldn't they be? How do I make sure that I'm building quotas that are going to create a high performance sales organization? Because when you start to set quotas that are way too high, people leave, and then you got attrition problem, and then your top performers go, and you create it's not a high performance sales organization. Enablement forms a key part to that, but also setting the milestones, those goals of what you expect. And to do that, setting quotas is hard. You got to be looking at things like productivity to understand it, and almost have a ratio of productivity to get to your quotas. So I think that's become also a lot more science. So in summary, I think, it's evolved, it's become more complex, but with that, there's more science to it. And I think that's what's been important. Because, Matt, I'll end off. It was very hard in the early days when we were very much at growth at all costs to go hire. When I was in EMEA, and we hired 40 salespeople because that was the plan. It turned out that we're just taking the demand engine down by 20% for that same year. That we've just added 40 people in. So to let go of 30 of those people, 6 months later, those aren't easy conversations, and it's almost, yeah, a very painful year. But those are the type of decisions, right? The decisions are made here. This is how many salespeople you need. Go hire them, and not actually looking at all the detail of how that funnel is going to work, and actually there will be enough food for everyone. There's going to be enough for everyone to succeed. It's good that there's more science behind it. One of the reasons we built Late is to put a bit more structure in, to put more guardrails, to have a process that you follow, to think about that as you go through it, and then give you the insights to be a bit more informed before you make those decisions. Because there's decisions and there's assumptions you're going to have to make. You've got to put that stake in the ground and then go execute against that stake for the following year.
Important to remember that all these plans that we put together and build, and these outcomes that we're looking to drive on the financial statements, they ultimately require and impact people, right? People are behind plans. People are part of plans. That's a big part of all this. They're not just numbers on spreadsheets or a computer screen. These implications obviously have real world implications on people on your team, and they're super important. So in the last couple of minutes, I just want to do some wrap up and kind of have each of the panelists leave. If you had to give one piece of advice to folks, obviously it's September as we get into planning, or hopefully people have already started thinking about planning for next year. What's one piece of advice that you'd want to leave with people? And Eddie, I'll start with you. I'll do Eddie, Nandini, Matthew, and then Werner.
Yeah, happily. So I think the first key point, and the most important before you even start, is alignment with the right stakeholders. So first, what's the strategic direction of your leaders, of corporate level, sales leaders? Like, what's your strategy? Do we want to land and expand? We want logos? And based on that, start building a plan. I'll leave time for the rest of the great folks here on their tips.
All right, Nandini, what about you?
I would say focus on sales productivity, and productivity is twofold. One is, what did the rep do, and what are the levers that we are going to pull to improve that rep's productivity? But also, is there enough white space in that account to actually go sell more in that account? Is there enough in that account to squeeze juice out of? So both these are important from a productivity standpoint. So focus on that.
Yeah, super important, right? The other thing is like total addressable market and opportunities that people have available, right? Like if they go out and they start closing business, but then their addressable market doesn't grow at all, they now have fewer things to go after to essentially accomplish the same thing, right? Like, again, these are all things that may not be obvious on the surface. Super important to think through. Matthew, what about you?
Yeah, I would say last but not least, your annual planning cycle needs a plan, a project plan. So assign yourself someone in your team or a project manager to help drive the rigor on it, and really treat it like a project with a precise timeline, decision logs, communication plans, change management plans, enablement plans that we've discussed earlier. So I have the utmost rigor on this, because otherwise it's not going to be, that'll be my last recommendation.
Yeah, I'll co-sign that one. I'm a big believer in the one throat to choke, if you will. We talked a lot about alignment, super important. Obviously, you need all these different teams and people involved. But if you then say all of you collectively are going to own the plan, all that's going to happen is everyone's just going to point at everyone else, being like, well, I thought you were doing that. Well, I thought you were doing that. Well, I thought you owned that. Right? Like, just give it to one person whose job it is to drive it from start to finish, because that accountability is ultimately needed. Werner, what about you? Closing thoughts to wrap us up here.
Yeah, I think just to add on to that, but Shannon put two things in the chat, was the calendar, think about it, your calendar, how you do it, but also the RACI, exactly to that point. One person owns it, but have a RACI, who's accountable, who's responsible, consulted and informed and so forth, and important to know. I think that just a short slide here before we go. So just start with the truth, not the target. Because there's reality. I mean, yes, we all want to grow super fast, but that's a big one. Test the decisions, do simulations, to understand what's happened. If we do this, what happens? Can we get there? Can we not? I like that this is always a big one, that we believe heavily in plan for reality, not the ambition. So it's sort of a start with the truth, not target. Of course, you've got to stretch people, but be realistic. And quotas should be empowering. I mentioned that earlier in that answer. Tie your quotas to productivity. And Nadine mentioned productivity, right? This is absolutely fundamental. What is the sales team producing today? If you know that, you've got a good sense of then probably where your quotas need to be. And execution is your feedback loop. Track your plan against the execution. Certainly, thinking about that annual plan and process, and one of those key actionable tips, which I love from the panel, and then these takeaways.
Yeah, super important. Annual plan is not something that should be a one and done sort of thing that you just pick up once a year. It lives, it breathes, it adjusts. You compare your actual results to it. That's the only way you can get better at it. But with that, we are at time. So I want to say thank you very much to all of our panelists for dropping some knowledge. This was incredible. I really, really appreciate it. And all of our attendees out there, thank you very much for joining us. But that is all that I have for you. So I will let you all run. Have a great rest of your Wednesday. And we'll see you all at the next one. Peace, everybody.